Chapters 25 and 26 of When Shadows Die, by E.D.E.N. Southworth. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25 Father and Daughter. It was not until the next June, when we had been parted nearly 2 years, that I saw my father again. He came over suddenly, and dropped down on us, so to speak, on the morning of the 5th of that month. Steward and housekeeper were both "taken aback" and "flustered," as they described themselves, yet they were not unprepared. The house was always as well kept as the circumstances would permit. Nor was Miss Murray. She also had done her duty, and could present her pupil without fear of criticism. We were both in the schoolroom, my governess and I, when the door opened and some one entered unannounced. I looked up from my slate to see a tall, stately man, with a pale face framed in black hair and black whiskers, standing in the doorway. I recognized my father, and flew to his embrace, before Miss Murray could rise to receive him with deliberate decorum. My father kissed me with much love, and received Miss Murray's greetings with stately politeness. Later on, when I had recovered from my surprise and excitement at his sudden appearance, he explained that he had but lately returned to England, and had taken his delicate wife and child to London, which was then, in the fine June days, at the height of the fashionable season, and had left them on a visit to his mother in law, the Dowager Lady Burnshot, who had a fine house near Hyde Park, and that he had seized this first opportunity to run to Ireland to see his dear little daughter. He further explained that he could not bring the countess and the little viscount, because she could not bear the sea air yet. He brought me a doll and a doll's set of furniture, all of which delighted me almost as much as his visit, for, will it be believed, I had not possessed a doll since the death of my own mother, and I was only 6 years old. My father remained only a few days at Weirdwaste, during which he invited the vicar and the doctor to dine and talk with him over the affairs of the estate and the condition of my health, to thank them for their past kindness, and to ask their continued supervision of his daughter's welfare. "I cannot take her with me to London at present," he said, "for we are visiting at the house of Lady Burnshot, the mother of my wife. Besides, I think, for her own sake, little Elfrida is much better here for a few years longer." The doctor and the vicar agreed with my father that I was much better off at Weirdwaste than I could be in London, and so there was no more to be said. My father took a very loving leave of me at the end of the week. After he was gone I grieved myself sick. I loved him so dearly. I longed to go with him so ardently. But it was not to be. Why do I linger over these details? Is it because we all grow garrulous when talking or writing of our childhood? Or is it because I dread to approach the period of my life's tragedy? Or do both these causes combine to influence me? I know not, but I know that I must hurry toward that from which I shrink. A few weeks after this, being in the heat of summer, my father came again to see me, bringing my stepmother and my little baby brother with him. He had written to apprise us of the visit, so we were all ready for him. All the animosity I had ever felt against my stepmother vanished when I saw her pale, patient face. My child heart pitied her, and from pity I loved her, and did everything in my small power to please her, except this: I would not call her mother. I said it would not be right toward my own dear mother, who was in heaven. And she kissed me, and said she only was sorry she had not been able to do a mother's part by her motherless child, for that she, too, would soon be in heaven, where she would meet my own mother, when she could only tell her that she loved, but had not been able to serve, her daughter. As for my infant brother, now a year old, I idolized him. His mother delighted in my affection for her child. I have not been able to be good to you, my poor little girl, but you will be good to him when I am gone, will you not?" she inquired. "Indeed, indeed, I will. I will love him better than myself. I will die for him," I said, taking the extravagant view, and using the exaggerated language that was usual with me. The chills of autumn come very early at Weirdwaste, and so about the middle of September, when the evenings began to be cold, my father took my stepmother and my baby brother back and settled them for a few weeks at Torquay, then believed to be the best winter resort in England. I grieved after them for a week or more, and oh, how I wondered why they could not take me with them. The reason was this, as I afterward learned, that the state of Lady Enderby's health made it impossible for me to be with them, especially in a lodging house. My father did not visit Weirdwaste again for a long time. He spent the winter with his wife and infant son at Torquay, and in the early summer took them to Switzerland, and in autumn to the Grecian archipelago. In fact, 2 more years passed before I saw my father again. Then it was June, and the height of the London season, and he had brought his wife to London and left her on a visit to her mother, the Baroness Burnshot. But on this occasion he brought my little brother over to Ireland and down to Weirdwaste. The child was now called Viscount Glennon, and was a beautiful boy, nearly 3 years old. I was at that time a little old woman of 8. All the years that I have lived, and all the sorrows that I have suffered, have never made me as old as I was at 8. But again my heart leaped to meet my father and brother, and I loved and adored them. I asked why my stepmother had not come with them. My father told me that she was much too frail to bear the sea air, even in summer. He was satisfied with my health and with my progress in learning, and so he left us, taking the boy with him. I had now been more than 4 years at dreary Weirdwaste, and had not known any home but the old manor house, or any society than its inmates. As these first 4 years passed, so passed the next 7. My father came about once a year to see me, bringing my brother with him. He always spent a week at Weirdwaste, and then returned to England, taking my brother with him. His time was entirely devoted to his invalid wife, whose life seemed only to be prolonged by his incessant care. They were always moving from place to place, as the seasons changed — in Switzerland, or in Norway, or Sweden in the summer, in the south of France, in Italy, or among the isles of the Grecian archipelago in winter. Sometimes in the finest weather of the early summer they came to London, during which time the countess would visit her mother, and then my father would take my little brother and come on a flying visit to me. So the years went on, until I reached my 15th year, when the days of my dark destiny drew near. CHAPTER XXVI Brighton, Years Ago. You may never have occasion to read these lines, yet I come to my task from time to time to prepare them for you. Let me resume. I never was reconciled to my lonely life at Weirdwaste, but as the years passed on, and I grew toward womanhood, the solitude and monotony of my surroundings pressed more and more heavily upon my health and spirits. My father, in these years, seemed almost to have forgotten me. He was with my mother on one of the islands of the Grecian archipelago, for her health. My little brother, now a well grown schoolboy, was at Rugby. You see, our family of 4 was scattered. About this time my health and spirits became so seriously affected that Dr. Alexander thought it necessary to call my father's attention to the fact. He wrote to him, and in due time received an answer. It was something to this effect: "As you recommend the South Coast, you will please take the girl to Brighton, and take suitable lodgings for herself and her attendants. As she is no longer a child, she must have more advanced teachers. Miss Murray may be retained as her companion or chaperon, but a French governess must be engaged for her. I leave all this to you. Our good vicar will be able to assist you. My son will join his sister at the seaside for the midsummer holidays. Draw on me for the necessary funds." The prospect of any change filled my soul with delightful anticipations. It was now the middle of June. By the 1st of July I was established in delightful lodgings on the King's Road, facing the sea. We had the whole of the first floor, consisting of a suite of 8 rooms, drawing room, dining room, schoolroom, bathroom, and 4 bedrooms. I was delighted with the gay vision of life and motion all around me. There seemed to be a perpetual gala. The splendor of the view from my front windows was not all the splendor of sea and sky. It was fleets of gaily decked craft, of all sizes and shapes, from the queenly yacht to the pretty little rowboats, and the pier, with its bazaars of toys, trinkets and jewelry; the bathing houses, the frolicsome children in the surf or on the sands, the brilliant crowds on the esplanade, the bands of music, the magnificent shops, with displays of sumptuous fabrics and splendid jewels, not to be surpassed in those of Paris or Constantinople. In fact, to me, who had never been in a town before — to me, coming from lonely and dreary Weirdwaste — Brighton was a dazzling, bewildering scene of light, life, gayety, splendor and magnificence. And if it was all this viewed only from the front windows of my lodgings, what was it, let me ask you, afterward, when my schoolboy brother and his friends came, full of high spirits, to make the most of our opportunities? On the second day after our installment at our lodgings we were joined by the French governess who had been engaged for me. She was a small, dark, middle aged woman, with black hair and sharp black eyes. Her name was de la Champe — Madame de la Champe. Her last place had been in the service of a duchess, whose last daughter having just been married, madame found herself under the necessity of seeking a new engagement, and had found one through the vicar's answer to her advertisement. I did not like her, though she came so highly recommended; but my prejudice against the Frenchwoman was not the slightest drawback to my intense enjoyment of my new and delightful surroundings. On the fourth day after our arrival we were joined by my brother and his friend. My brother was then a bright lad of 12, looking older than his years, because he was really a very precocious boy. He greeted me with the warmest affection, and promised me a jolly old time. His friend was Angus Anglesea, a young man 8 years his senior, who, however, had formed a strong attachment for the bright lad, and taken him under his protection. Angus Anglesea was at this time about 20 years of age, with a form of medium height, slender and fair, with light hair and mustache, and blue eyes. His appearance and manners were pleasing and attractive. I could not have believed any evil of him then. On the day after the arrival of my brother and his friend, the good doctor, who had accompanied us to Brighton, took his leave, after having warned my teachers that their office was, for the present, a sinecure, and that there were really to be no lessons for the next 3 months, or until my health should be fully reestablished. After the doctor left, our days were given up to enjoyment: walks on the esplanade, sails on the sea, bathing in the surf, drives along the coast, rides over the downs, saunters on the Pure — a perpetual recurrence of delightful recreations, each one enhancing the pleasures of all the others. It seemed paradise to me. My brother lived with us, of course. Angus Anglesea had lodgings near us, and came every day to join in our amusements. The 11th Hussars were stationed at Brighton Barracks then, and the officers were often on parade. Anglesea was not at that time in the army. He received his commission afterward, but he knew a number of the officers, and introduced some of them to me. My French governess or my English teacher was always at my side on these occasions. So 3 enchanting months passed. My brother's holidays were over, and he was now to go to Eton. My father's London solicitor was charged with the duty of making all the arrangements for his entrance into college. On the 15th of September he left me, with the promise to return and spend the Christmas holidays with me, for I was to winter at Brighton. Angus Anglesea remained at Brighton. Friends and neighbors of his father's in Lancashire, the Earl and Countess of Middlemoor, with their only daughter, had arrived at their seaside home on Brunswick Terrace, and Anglesea had remained to see them. Even then he was reported to be engaged to the Lady Mary. Soon I heard that young Anglesea had left his lodgings and accepted the invitation of the earl and countess to make their house his home during his sojourn at the seaside. After this we did not see so much of young Anglesea. He came but seldom to our lodgings, and never joined us in our walks on the seaside. Whenever we chanced to meet him, he was in the company of the Middlemoors, either driving or walking with them. If Brighton had seemed to me the paradise of life and light, splendor and gaiety, in the summer months, when the season was at its lowest ebb, what was it, if you please, in the early autumn, when the tide of wealth and fashion set in? No words of mine can describe my impression of it, my delight in it. The bijou of a theater and the elegant assembly rooms were opened for the season. The paradise was one panorama of brilliant crowds. It was like nothing real to my simplicity. CHAPTER 27 and 28 of When Shadows Die, by E.D.E.N. Southworth. This recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER 27 Luigi Saviola. I come now to the most fateful day of my unhappy life — the day on which Luigi Saviola was presented to me. It was in November, but it was bright and sunny on the seashore. My companion and chaperon, once my English teacher, Miss Murray, was confined to the house by a slight attack of bronchitis, which she was carefully nursing lest it should become serious. I was walking on the esplanade, attended by my French governess. At that early hour, 10 in the morning, there were but few people out besides nursemaids and children. We were sauntering along slowly, when we saw coming toward us Anglesea and another young gentleman, walking arm in arm, apparently on the most friendly and even affectionate terms. In a few minutes we met face to face. Anglesea bowed, and then presented his companion, Prince Luigi Saviola. Madame de la Champe received the stranger's low bow with all the courtesy of her nation. I do not know how I received him. I wore a little round turban hat, with a little thin gray gauze mask veil over my face, which completely shaded my features, while it enabled me to look at the stranger. I know not if there be any such thing as love at first sight, for the only real, lasting love of my life was of slow growth, as you know, Abel. Oh, Abel, you do know that I love you." "No, I do not believe there is such a thing as real love at first sight, but I do know that there is a madness that apes it. Some fascination made me look at this Italian from behind the shield of my gray veil, while he talked with my vivacious French governess, who quickly engaged him in conversation. He was young, quite youthful, indeed, and it is a very effeminate term to apply to a man but he was beautiful. Not handsome, but beautiful. He was of medium height and slender proportions, but he was perfectly elegant in form and perfectly graceful in gesture. His profile was purely, finely Grecian. His complexion pale and clear. His hair, eyebrows and mustache of darkest brown. His eyes of darkest violet blue. Yet all this description gives but the outline of the youth's form and face. It cannot give the subtle and exquisite charm of expression which was the chief beauty of his aspect, nor can it give the lingering music of the most melodious voice that ever spoke. Are you displeased with me that I describe this stranger so minutely? I do it in cold blood, Abel, and only that you may understand and perhaps pardon the fascination he possessed over a sensitive, imaginative young recluse, such as I had been. And some instinct told me even then that this attraction was mutual, though we did not exchange a word and he could clearly see my face. After a few moments of courteous conversation the two young gentlemen bowed and walked on. I went home in a dream, the face and voice of the young stranger haunting my spirit. The Frenchwoman made some few favorable remarks on the manner and appearance of the young Italian, but I did not reply. I could not. I passed the day in a vision. I was like one possessed. 2 days later young Anglesea made us the first call of many days. Madame de la Champe immediately beset him with questions about the young Italian. I said nothing, but listened with the deepest interest for his replies. This is a confession, you know, Abel, and I mean that it shall be a full one. I listened with the most eager curiosity to hear all that could be told of one who had taken complete possession of my fancy and imagination, if not of my heart. And what Anglesea told us of Luigi Saviola did but deepen the profound interest I already took in the young stranger. He told us that Saviola was of a royal race, yet of advanced republican ideas; that for the expression of his principles he was a political exile. He was wealthy, and his wealth had been confiscated. He was now living in Brighton, on the wreck of his fortune, but was brave, cheerful and heroic, as we had seen him. All this, as I say, deepened my interest in Saviola and heightened my admiration for him. He was no longer a most charming person, but he was a hero and a martyr, a patriot and a humanitarian. And already I loved, adored, worshiped him, or believed that I did. You see, Abel, what a very foolish virgin I was. But then I was a motherless child. Anglesea was devoted to Saviola, and expressed the most profound esteem and admiration for him. He asked permission to bring the young Italian to call on us. It was an indiscreet request to make, but Anglesea was young and impulsive. It was an improper favor to grant, but my governess was vain and faithless, and had herself taken a fancy to the young Italian, so she consented that he should come. The intervening time between this day and the day of the visit was passed by me in a state of feverish anticipation. The next evening Anglesea brought Saviola. He was much more attractive than ever. He talked mostly with Madame de la Champe, but I felt that he looked mostly at me, who scarcely ever uttered a word. This was the first of many calls, for some time made only in the company of his friend, and received by me only in the company of one or both of my governesses. How can I tell you the progress of that infatuation, hallucination, call it what you please, that kindled at the first meeting and increased with every after interview? Saviola never sat by my side in those early days, never took my hand, except at meeting and parting, when, with the reverential tenderness of his race, he would raise it to his lips, bowing over it. He scarcely ever addressed me with words, but with glances — how eloquently! All the wooing was done through the passionate eyes. At first I could not look at him at all, then only very shyly, and then at length my eyes seemed irresistibly attracted to meet his, even to seek to meet his. Oh, Abel, I am telling you everything. I am unveiling my heart to you. How will you receive my confession? Will you believe that there was no conscious sense of wrongdoing at the time? But indeed there was none. Will you believe the stranger truth that this was not love which I gave to Luigi? I did not know what love meant until I met the one love of my life, years after this lunacy. Oh, Abel, believe that this delirium was not love, though even I, knowing no better, mistook it for love at the time. It was madness. It was hero worship, enthusiasm, but not love. This young Italian exile, beautiful as Adonis in his person, was idealized and glorified in my vision by his history. Remember how young I was, scarcely past childhood, and remember how I had lived isolated from all society, of my own rank and age, secluded in a desolate old manor house on the Irish coast, whose very name, Weirdwaste, could not tell its dreariness, spending my solitary life in wandering by the seashore during the days, reading the old romances and poems left on the bookshelves of the old manor house, and dreaming dreams and seeing visions that seemed to have come to be realized in my present surroundings and crystallized in the person of Saviola. Oh, Abel! Oh, Abel! Pity and pardon me if you can, for now I come to the part of my life which I shrink from approaching as a child would shrink from a fierce fire. Luigi came every day now, whether Anglesea accompanied him or not. I had learned a little Italian from Miss Murray, at Weirdwaste, and now Madame de la Champe was continuing my studies in that language. Luigi found it out, and begged her permission to bring me some standard Italian works, and to assist me in the translation. Madame, who looked upon me only as a child, and thought the attention of the young Italian so many tributes to her own charms, very affably consented, and so the exile became my unpaid master in Italian. The standard works he brought were all poetry — Petrarch's, Tasso's, and others' impassioned songs. These he translated for me in more ways than one — with his pen, with his tongue, and more eloquently and effectively still with his glorious eyes. As for me, I was far gone in madness before Luigi ever had the opportunity to speak one direct word of love to me. The inevitable hour came at last. I was reading Italian poetry with Luigi. Madame de la Champe sat near, working a screen in Berlin wool. Suddenly she got up and left the room to match some shade of worsted. The next instant Saviola was at my feet, and in a sudden tempest of impassioned words he told me what his eyes had told me long ago. This was the first time we had been alone since we had met on the esplanade, and he had seized the occasion. I could not reply to him, but I did not repulse him, and he saw that I did not wish to do so. "Madame," I whispered, as I heard the Frenchwoman's approach, which had not attracted his attention. He arose at once and resumed his attitude of teacher. Madame entered. She had not been gone 2 minutes. Gradually, as the intimacy between madame and the exile advanced, her strict surveillance over me was relaxed. I was still a child in her eyes, and she was a charming woman who had fired the young Italian with admiration, so she did not fear to leave Luigi and myself together. As for Miss Murray, she hated all foreigners, especially Italians, and most especially political exiles, so she was seldom present during Saviola's calls. We had many a tete-a-tete, and for a few weeks we lived happily in mere certainty that we could see and talk with each other every day. But then came a change. Luigi became restless and unhappy. He never smiled now; he often sighed heavily. He grew paler than his custom, and very thin. Madame, poor madame, thought the youth was pining away for her love, and surely she did all she could to encourage him to speak plainly to her — all she could, except to tell him in so many words that she was ready to marry him. One day she sent me out of the room, and was with him alone for an hour. I think then she really did propose to him, and that he saved himself without wounding her, for when she recalled me to the room Saviola was gone, and she was in tears, when she said to me: 'Ah, the poor prince! He is so honorable, so conscientious. He sacrifices. He immolates himself. It is for duty. It is for patriotism. We must cure him of all that." CHAPTER XXVIII A MAD ACT So, thanks to the blind vanity of the French governess, the young Italian and her pupil escaped her suspicion. We were Romeo and Juliet. We were Francesca and Paolo, Tasso and Leonora. Ah, I have often thought since that it was well, in the interest of poetry and romance, that the story of these lovers never carried them into matrimony, for such delirious passion is not the love that lasts through a long life. A disastrous day was fast approaching us. Luigi had been for some time suffering under the deepest depression of spirits. Madame looked at him and sighed, as if she understood his secret sorrow and could console him, if he were not so morbidly honorable and conscientious, if he were not so determined to sacrifice, to immolate himself on the altar of duty and patriotism. One morning she left the room on some errand that her restlessness suggested. In another moment Luigi was again at my feet, pleading with me now to give myself to him, or rather to take him for myself, for my lover, adorer and husband at once and forever. He explained in rapid, vehement words that he was recalled to Italy, that he must go, that he could not and would not leave me behind; he would rather die than leave me. All this and much more he poured forth in a torrent of words, to which I only replied by tears. He went on rapidly explaining, lest we should be interrupted before he got through. He told me that all was arranged for our flight, that Anglesea would help us and keep our secret. "Madame," I whispered, as my quick ears heard a footstep on the hall outside. "Meet me on the pier, 4 o'clock this afternoon. Come without fail, if you care to save me from self destruction," he hastily whispered as he arose and resumed his seat. It was not madame who entered, however; it was Miss Murray. She bowed stiffly to the Italian, and then glanced searchingly around the room. Seeing no one present but Saviola and myself, realizing that we were tete a tete, she frowned and sharply demanded: "Where is madame?" "She has just left the room," I replied. "Very improper, very irregular, most reprehensible. I shall write to day," she said, as she sat down bolt upright on the chair nearest us. Miss Murray was a conscientious woman, and she did her duty; there was no doubt of that; but her words and her threatened action decided me. Swift as lightning through my mind sped this question: What will be the effect of her letter to my father? Something that will separate me at once and forever from Saviola? I could not for a moment endure the thought. I looked at my lover, and my look said plainly as tongue could speak: "I will meet you and go with you to Italy." And his eyes responded with equal clearness: "I understand you, and I thank and bless you." Soon after he took a formal leave of me, and raised Miss Murray's hand to his lips and kissed it with devotional tenderness as he bowed. "He is a very perfect gentleman, as indeed, why should he not be? A man of his rank," said the half appeased, old maiden lady. "But all the same, my dear, he is young and unmarried, and a foreigner; and what is worse still, he is a political refugee. Always suspicious characters, my dear; always suspicious characters." "But Prince Saviola is well introduced, Miss Murray, and he is staying with the Middlemoors," I ventured to advance in my lover's defense. "Very true, my dear; but that does not prevent him from being a foreigner and a political refugee," persisted Miss Murray, in her most absolute manner. "I cannot deny the fact," I admitted. And then I went to my room and packed a small handbag with the merest necessities for my journey. We still kept schoolroom hours for meals, and had our dinner at 2 o'clock. Madame drank claret and Miss Murray stout at dinner, but both equally went to sleep in their easy chairs over the drawing room fire, while I was supposed to be busy with my exercises until the 5 o'clock tea. Now was my opportunity. As soon as my governesses were both asleep in their chairs, I left the room, went up to my chamber, put on my outdoor dress, took my traveling bag, and left the house. Never was there before so perfectly easy and simple a flight. I walked down the King's Road until I reached the new pier, and there at the land end I met Saviola and Anglesea waiting for me. A close carriage stood within call. Saviola was very much agitated. It was Anglesea who spoke first. "My dear little girl," he said, as if he had been speaking to his niece or younger sister, "I do not at all approve of these proceedings; but as I feel perfectly certain that you would go on without my consent and assistance, I think it is best, in the interests of your absent family, that I should aid and abet you in what you do, see you safely, legally and regularly through it. Now do not be frightened. We shall take the train for London, thence the night express for Scotland. And to morrow morning, as soon as we are over the border, you shall be married. I shall not leave you until I witness the ceremony and hold the certificate in my pocket. You will write to your father and plead your cause as no one but yourself can do so well. Perhaps he will storm, perhaps he will reproach you, but he will end in forgiving you, when he has considered all the circumstances. Here is the carriage." While Anglesea had been talking, Saviola had brought up the vehicle, and now he handed me into it and entered himself, followed by Anglesea. We drove at once to the station and took tickets for London Bridge. In 5 minutes we three were crowded into a coupe, and in a little more than an hour we were at London Bridge. Anglesea, who had resumed the role of friend, guide and protector to the two young maniacs, took us to a quiet family hotel, where we three got supper in a private sitting room. "I assure you I do all this in the interests of my friends, your relatives, my dear. I knew that Saviola would, sooner or later, run off with you, so I determined to see you safely through it all," he explained again, as we sat down to supper. When the meal was over, Anglesea called a cab, and we all drove to King's Cross Station, where we were just in time to catch the night express on the Great Northern Railway. Anglesea took a compartment for ourselves, and took along also a basket of fruit, a bag of cakes, and a box of bonbons, for he knew that I was still child enough to love sweetmeats. He also took half a dozen of bottled lemonade and ginger beer. We none of us slept a wink that night, but laughed and talked all night, and ate and drank at intervals. I did not at all feel the gravity of the situation. I had not left anyone behind whom I cared much about, or to whom I thought I owed any duty, so I had no regrets or compunctions on that score. As for my dear father, time, absence and negligence had really estranged us, or seemed to have done so. I even thought my marriage might bring us closer together, for Luigi had promised to take me to him as soon as he should consent to see me. So, without a regret for the past, or a misgiving of the future, I yielded myself up to the joy of the present. It was a very happy journey. Excitement kept us all from feeling the least sense of fatigue. About dawn we stopped at a wayside station. "Here we are," said Anglesea, as the guard called out the name of the place. We alighted, and Anglesea, keeping up his role, proposed that we should go first to the hotel which stood on the other side of the track. "We must get washed and combed and fed, my children, before we can present ourselves before the minister," he said, speaking to us as if we were indeed children and he were quite a venerable party. He was, in truth, younger by a year than Saviola. We went to the hotel, the Victoria, where 2 rooms were engaged, one for me alone and one for Anglesea and Saviola jointly. I went to mine to refresh my toilet. I had never dressed myself without the help of a maid in my life, and hardly knew how to go about it. However, I rang for the chambermaid, and with her assistance I took a bath and made a change of clothes. After this I went down and joined Anglesea and Saviola in the ladies' parlor. They took me to breakfast in the coffee room, and soon after that we all three walked out in search of a minister. No marriage license was required in Scotland. We found a church, with a parsonage adjoining. We all three passed through the gate leading into the grounds before the house, but only Anglesea went up to the door and rang the bell. A servant maid opened to the summons. Anglesea spoke to her, and both disappeared in the house, leaving the door ajar. After a few minutes Anglesea reappeared at the door, and with a smile beckoned us to come in. We entered the hall, and were immediately conducted by our guide, philosopher and friend to the minister's study on the right hand of the hall. There stood a venerable man, with white hair, and clothed in clerical black, to receive us. Very few questions were put to us, and our answers, mostly given through Anglesea, were satisfactory. We were then asked to come up and take our stand before the minister, and in a very few minutes the marriage ceremony, which I believed had made us man and wife, was completed. Then the old minister gave us a solemn lecture on the duties we had assumed, and then he made a fervent prayer for us, and ended by giving us his blessing. Anglesea paid him a munificent fee, for which the old man gave him thanks. "And a marriage certificate, if you please, reverend sir. I am acting on the part of this young lady's absent friends, and I must omit no necessary formality," said Anglesea. The demand was unusual. Their certificate was considered unnecessary. The old minister told us so, and added that he had no printed form, and never had had any. "Then we will take a written form. Just write that on this day, in this place, You have united in marriage Luigi Saviola of Naples, Italy, and Elfrida Glennon of Northumberland, England. Sign it yourself as the minister, and allow me to sign it as a witness. It would also be better, too, if you could call in some member of your family to sign as a second witness. I think I have seen the young woman who let us in peeping through the door through the whole performance. Please call her as a second witness." The old man sighed, and sat down to the table where his stationery lay, and wrote out the certificate. Anglesea read it critically, expressed himself satisfied, affixed his signature as witness, and then put the pen in the hand of the maid who had been called in for the purpose, and who now scrawled her name under that of Anglesea. And it was finished. CHAPTER 29 and 30 of When Shadows Die, by E.D.E.N. Southworth. This recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER 29 After the Marriage. We took leave of the old minister, who shook hands warmly with us at parting, repeating his benediction. We returned to the hotel, where Anglesea paid the bill and reclaimed our bags. Then we went to the station, where we had to wait some little time for the London train. It came up about 9 o'clock. We entered it, and were off to London. The daylight journey was even more pleasant than our festive night ride. I, who had been so confined all my life, could see the beautiful and varied scenery, the lakes and mountains of Northumberland, the moors and forests of Yorkshire, the castles, country seats, hamlets and farmhouses along the way, and to me all this was novel and delightful. We reached London at nightfall, and there we parted with Anglesea, who returned to Brighton to rejoin his friends, the Middlemores. As we were really very tired with our 24 hours of travel without sleep, we went to the Norfolk Hotel for the night. The next day we spent in seeing some of the sights of London, which I had never seen, and which, of course, filled me with wonder and interest. Indeed, all my life since I had left Weirdwaste was marvelously changed and enlarged, even as if I were born in a new world. The next morning we took the tidal train from London Bridge, and went down to Dover to meet the Calais boat. "We will spend a month in Paris, my soul," said Luigi to me, as we entered the train. "A full month, no less, my life." "But have you not to go immediately to Italy?" I inquired. "Oh, no. I am recalled that is, I am permitted to return, not commanded to do so," he explained. "Oh, then I misunderstood you." "Yes," he said. "And your estates, dear Luigi, are they restored to you?" I next inquired, without one mercenary thought in my heart. "Yes," he replied, with a curious smile. "Such as they are, my love and life, they are restored to me." "What do you mean?" I questioned. "They were not worth keeping from me, my own. Yet fear not, I am not without resources. We shall spend a gay month in Paris." And so we did. We reached that city the next morning, and took apartments at the Splendid. If to my rustic mind Brighton had been a delight, Paris was now a rapture. "Is there," I asked of Luigi, after only one day's experience of the city, "is there another place in all this world so heavenly as Paris?" He looked at me a few seconds in silence, and then replied, with more knowledge than his years could have promised: "No, my soul, there is no place on this planet so celestial or so infernal as this city." I stared at him in dismay. "Never fear, my love. You shall never see or hear the infernos of the city." That day I took time to write to my father. I had not an hour's leisure during our mad journeys to do so before. I told him all the circumstances and all the experiences of outer and inner life that had driven me to take my fate in my own hands and go away with Luigi Saviola to be married. And I gave him all the details of the journey and the ceremony. And I ended by imploring him to forgive us both and to receive us on a visit. After that act of duty I plunged with Luigi into all the gayeties of gay Paris, and saw no sign of the infernos. Music, the drama, balls, excursions, these filled up our days for a month of mad rapture. Then, about the middle of December, we went down to Marseilles, and took a steamer to Naples, where we arrived in health, spirits and safety. I had often questioned Luigi about his family, but he told me he had none to speak of. He was an only child. His father and mother were among the angels in heaven. His uncle was a priest and missionary in Brazil. His 2 aunts were nuns, one in a Benedictine convent in France, the other in an Augustine sisterhood in Spain. I had questioned him about his home. He had described to me a half ruined and wholly uninhabitable castle situated among the forest covered mountains of the wild Abruzzo. But oh, how I longed to go there! All my love of the historic, the romantic, the picturesque was engaged in that longing. On our landing at Naples I proposed to go. But he told me that at this season of the year the roads were so very bad as to render the journey impracticable. He took me to the Vittoria, where we rested for a few days. Here again I wrote to my father, telling him of my first letter, which I feared had never reached him, and repeating at length the story of my marriage, and the plea for his pardon. I waited weeks for an answer before I gave up hope. Naples did not offer many sources of amusement, but we availed ourselves of all that was to be obtained. It was during our sojourn in this city that I gradually learned what I was very unwilling to believe and very deeply distressed to know, namely, the nature of those resources of which Luigi had spoken to me. They were the gaming tables, at which he was almost always a successful player. My hero and martyr and patriot was a gambler. It was a great grief, and I never really recovered from it. He won large sums of money and lavished gifts upon me which gave me no pleasure. About the middle of February we went to Rome for the carnival, for Lent was rather late this year. And after the week of orgies we still remained in the Eternal City until the end of March, that I might see all its glories, and, ah me, not a few of its shames. In April we went to Venice, the city of 100 isles. I thought I had seen the most marvelous and enchanting things in the world, but here again wonder upon wonder burst upon my amazed soul. Why should I go on writing all this like the index of a guidebook? You and I have gone over Europe together. You know me, and may judge what it was to me the first time. Let me be brief now. Luigi, wherever we went, pursued his profession, and was never without revenues. I looked in vain for any sign of heroism, self devotion, or patriotism in him. Sometimes in the cities we passed through, in the public gardens, or the parlors of hotels, I heard questions discussed which stirred my blood, questions of the rights of man and all its ramifications, questions that made my heart beat in sympathy. They never moved him. And I wondered. Once I asked him if he really had lost all interest in the welfare of the world. He shrugged his shoulders and replied that he had never felt any. On another occasion, when I spoke of the elevation of mankind, he answered: "We are young, we are fair. We are healthy, we are happy. Let us enjoy ourselves and let mankind go to Hades." My dark eyed Luigi was neither hero nor martyr, neither patriot nor humanitarian. He was only a beautiful and joyous youth, bent on making the merriest of every hour of life at cost of anybody else, except of himself and me. Oh, how I was disappointed in him! A broken idol is a very sad event in the life of a romantic dreamer, I fancy. I began to try to remember how I had ever got the idea that he was a patriot and a political refugee, and the rest of it. And I recollected that it was from Anglesea and from Madame de la Champe. He, Luigi, had never pretended to be anything but my lover, and he was my lover still. He continued to be my lover to the last of his short, young life. I must pass on now to the tragedy of our marriage. CHAPTER XXX AWAKENING There is not in this world of sin A soul so deeply sunk therein, Thronged though it be with crimes and cares, Revenges, malice, despairs. However dire the phantoms there, However pestilent its air, But in its thoroughfares night and day There ever is some golden ray, Like a sweet child from home astray, Some light of heaven, some fragment thence Of primal love and innocence, Which keeps the angels on its track To lure and win and lead it back. William H. Holcombe. We lived at the best hotels in every town and city where we stopped, but we never stayed long at any place. Saviola was too successful a gambler for that. He was always kind to me, and would have loaded me with jewels and costly dress, but that I would have none of them, for my soul was troubled by the way in which he made his money, a way that he no longer tried to conceal from me. I had periodical fits of homesickness, during which I wrote to my father and to my teachers, but without in any instance receiving a reply. Then I would write again and again, with no better result. And finally I would give up hoping to hear from them, and try to resign myself to my fate, until my next attack of homesickness would set my pen in motion again. Later on, not homesickness alone, but remorse and despair and terror seized me. I was beginning to lose all hope of ever being forgiven by my father. And, ah me! I was also beginning to lose esteem for my husband, for whose sake I had left all my friends and relations. Luigi was still fond of me, in that way that a child is fond of a favorite toy of which he is not yet tired. I had discovered my own self deception. Other young girls have come to grief and death through their deception by others. I had only myself to blame. Myself had only deceived me. But it was bitter, oh, how bitter, to find out that the hero, martyr, patriot and humanitarian I had imagined was only a very handsome young gambler, who was not too honest or truthful. My undeceived soul sickened at him and at myself. My very last attack of homesickness found us at Geneva, where we had an elegant suite of apartments in the Hotel Beau Rivage. Again, in one day, I wrote 5 letters to absent friends: to my father, to Miss Murray, to Madame de la Champe, to Dr. Alexander, and to the Rev. Mr. Clement. From some of these I should surely get an answer. But week after week passed, and no answer came to me. In the 2nd month after our arrival at Geneva, Saviola was suddenly called to Paris. On imperative business, he said, but I had learned to distrust. I could not accompany him. My state of health utterly precluded the idea of my traveling. He took a very affectionate leave of me, and promised to be back again in a few days. A few days is a vague term, yet I was not disturbed by that. He left me, and I never saw his face again. Just 1 week after he went away my child was born, a boy. I was very healthy, and had a rapid convalescence, notwithstanding the suspense and anxiety I was suffering on account of my father. I wrote to Luigi, to the address he had given me, and informed him of the event, but I received no reply to my letter. Yet I got better every day, and I took great comfort and delight in my child. Also, I daily expected the return of Saviola to answer my letter in person, for I remembered that he hated to write, and was therefore one of the very worst correspondents in the world. But I was disappointed. Day followed day, week succeeded week, and I neither saw nor heard from Saviola, nor received any answers to any letter written to my father and friends. I knew that my father must long have left the archipelago, but I supposed that he must have, as usual, left orders for any letters that might come for him after his departure to be forwarded to his new address. So, though I had expected delay, I had not anticipated final disappointment. It was now the 1st of October, and many tourists were leaving the lake. Saviola had left me amply provided with funds, so that I had no fear of embarrassment, especially as I was very economical, only applying the ill-gotten money to my barest necessities. Besides, I had my boy, so that I was able to wait quite cheerfully the return of my husband. Ah me! It was not Saviola that I was troubled about; it was my father. At length it occurred to me to write to my father's London bankers to inquire for him, and I wondered that I had never thought of doing so before. On this occasion I received a prompt answer, which was at once encouraging and depressing, as you will see, contradictory as the statement seems. Mr. Rhodes told me that the earl had taken the countess to the Canaries for her ladyship's health, and that they had wintered there, but that in May they had sailed for an extensive yachting cruise, from which they were expected to return to England sometime in February. So my father could never have received any of my letters, and was therefore not the unbending, unforgiving, pitiless father I had thought him. He had probably written me many letters whose final destination was the dead letter office. I might still hope for his ready forgiveness. So far the news was encouraging. But then, on the other hand, he would not return until February. This was the depressing feature in the letter. Yet the encouraging circumstances outweighed the depressing item, so that, on the whole, I was more hopeful and more cheerful. As the days of October grew shorter and cooler I began to be impatient to leave the place, and for this reason eager for the return of Saviola. At length I grew really despondent. It was about this time, the middle of October, that I saw in the little Geneva paper an item that startled and delighted me. It was under the head of arrivals. It was but a line: "The Honorable Angus Anglesea, England, Hotel des Bergues." Without an instant's delay I sat down and wrote a note, asking him to call on me at the Beau Rivage. The thought of meeting one home face, and that the face of my brother's dear friend, Saviola's good friend, my own true friend, who had traveled with us to Scotland to see that I should be regularly married before he left me under the protection of Saviola, filled my soul with delightful anticipations. He came promptly in response to my summons. It was only noon when the waiter opened the door of the little drawing room where I sat, and announced: "The Honorable Mr. Anglesea." I sprang up and held out both my hands to welcome him. He raised one to his lips, bowed over it, and said: "I hope I find you well, madame." "Oh, I am so glad to see you!" I exclaimed, at random. He took a seat. I sank into my easy chair, my heart beating with excitement, with tumult, only to see the face of a friend. "I am very happy to come to you," he said. "I hope Saviola is well," he added, dubiously, as I thought. "He is always well," I replied. "He is in Paris." "You hear from him daily, of course?" "No. He is a poor correspondent. I shall not hear from him until I see him, I fear." He looked very grave, but made no comment. I hastened to ask him if he knew where my father then was. His reply confirmed the banker's news, the truth of which, by the way, I had never doubted. He said that my father was wintering in the Canaries for the sake of the countess' health, and that Viscount Glennon, my brother, was with them. This was the reason, then, why I had never heard from my brother. Mr. Anglesea appeared preoccupied while he spoke. Then, after a short silence, he said: "Ah, madame, pray do not consider me impertinent. Believe me, I speak only in your own interests." "As you acted when you went to Scotland with us," I added. "Precisely, Madame la Princesse." "Then speak freely, Mr. Anglesea. I shall not take offense." "Then I wish to inquire when you last heard from Luigi Saviola." I hated to answer that question, to confess the many days that had elapsed since I had seen or heard from my husband. Yet I answered: "I have not heard from him since he left here for Paris, 6 weeks ago." "Ah!" he said, very gravely. "But I expect to see him soon," I added. "Indeed!" he exclaimed, in surprise. "Yes, indeed! Of course! Why not?" I demanded, in astonishment. He was silent. "Why not?" I again demanded, uneasily. He looked grave. "What do you mean, Mr. Anglesea?" I exclaimed, anxiously. "Ah, madame," he sighed, "you know so little of the world so little of the world. Mr. Anglesea, you distress me. Has anything happened to Saviola?" "Ah, madame, you were but a child when you went off to marry the Italian. I, knowing full well that I could not prevent that mad act, which was sure to take place, went with you, for your sake, for your brother, my friend's sake, to prevent any fatal error from being committed. I thought I had prevented calamity to you. I know better now. Ah, yes." "Mr. Anglesea," I said, "you frighten me. What has happened? I implore you to tell me." "Not now. I cannot. But do not be alarmed. Take courage. I am your friend. I will see you through this trouble." "No! You must tell me now. Has I could scarcely bear to put the question, but I nerved myself to do it. Has Luigi left me? Deserted me?" And I sank back and covered my burning face with my hands. "How shall I answer your question, madame? But put the question rather to your own intelligence. He left here 6 weeks ago. He has not returned or written to you since. Any one less youthful, innocent and inexperienced than yourself would draw inferences from these circumstances. Will you excuse me now? I will see you this evening. May I?" "Yes," I answered, mechanically. He bowed and left the room. I was alone again. I wished to be alone to collect my thoughts. It had never occurred to me that Saviola would desert me never. He had ceased to be my king, my hero, my idol. He had revealed himself to be a gambler, a sharper, an adventurer. I had long ceased to love, trust, or respect him. Still, I knew that he was fond of me in his way, and so I never imagined that he could forsake me. And now that the possibility was presented to me, it filled me with more wonder than sorrow or mortification. I was not nearly so much troubled by the possible desertion of Saviola as I had been by the long silence and fancied implacability of my father. I was sorry for Saviola only because, though I had ceased to love, or trust, or respect the man, I had begun to compassionate him. He seemed so much weaker than I was. With this feeling of pity and regret was mingled one of intense relief. I had so little to lose in losing the man whose life was a constant source of shame and fear to me. But whatever he may have been, his rank was unquestionable. I had been lawfully married to him, and I was the Princess Saviola, and my son was Prince Rolando Saviola. No one could deprive us of these old and honorable, though now empty, titles. I soon reconciled myself to my desertion, even if I did not rejoice in my deliverance. I made up my mind to take my child and go directly to Weirdwaste, my own inheritance from my mother, and there await my father's return to England, then confess the whole truth to him and throw myself upon his love and protection. But, ah, Heaven, I did not yet know the worst. End of chapter 30. Chapters 31 and 32 of When Shadows Die, by E.D.E.N. Southworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Chapter 31. Pretended Consolation. In the evening Anglesea called on me again. His manner was full of the most respectful sympathy. He was my brother's dearest friend. He had acted in my father's and my brother's absence as my own best friend. And, since he could not prevent my romantic escapade, he had attended me in the character of a guardian, to see that no fatal mistake was made through Saviola's ignorance of national laws and customs. Therefore, I had every reason to trust in him and confide in him as in an elder brother. I was alone in the little drawing room when he entered. I received him as warmly, though more gravely, than when he had called at noon. When we were seated I asked him, as I would have asked my brother, whether my husband had really finally abandoned me. He looked searchingly into my face, as if to see how I would be likely to take his answer. Finding in my expression no very distressing anxiety, but simply a wish to know the truth, he replied: "Saviola has disappointed us all. If I were not speaking to you, I should say that he is scarcely worthy of thought, still less of regret." "But, are you sure? Has he really and finally abandoned me?" I repeated. "He has. You are sure of this?" "I am." His words and tones were grave, sweet and compassionate. "Where is he now?" I next inquired. "In Paris." "I must write to him again, then," I said, with the idea that, although I no longer loved or respected the man, he was my husband, and to write to him was my duty. "I will write to him to night." "You may do so," he said, gravely and tenderly. "Nay, I would even counsel you to do so for the relief of your own mind, and that you may never have the slightest cause for self reproach. But I warn you that it will have no effect whatever upon Saviola. He will not answer your letter." "He has not answered any letter of mine since he left for Paris. But surely if I write and ask him, plainly, whether he ever means to return to me, and beg him to reply, so that I may know what to do, he will answer." "No, he will not. But to satisfy yourself, write to him at once. Then you will know, Elfrida." In the days when we three, Anglesea, my brother, and myself, were as intimate and familiar as the children of one house, he had followed suit with Francis and called me by my Christian name, and sometimes by its abbreviation. I had liked it then, and I liked it now, though this was the first time since my marriage that he had given it to me. "Yes, I will write to night. I will write at once," I said. "Then I will bid you good evening. There is a mail that closes at 11 o'clock. If I leave you now you may be able to secure it," he said, rising. "Thank you, Angus. Come again to morrow," I said, using the name I had been accustomed to give him when he was the daily and beloved companion of my brother and myself. He took my hand, bowed over it, and left the room. Then I sat down to my desk to write the letter to Saviola in Paris. I did not reproach him, nor lament his absence, nor write in any way unkindly or sorrowfully to him. I simply reminded him how long he had been gone, how many letters I had written that remained unanswered, and then inquired whether he meant to return to me, and if so, when. I ended by telling him that my little son and myself were in good health, and begging him to answer me to the point that I might know what to do. So I left him at perfect liberty to act for himself. When I had sealed and directed this letter, I rang and dispatched it to the hotel bag that left the house at 11:15. Then I went to bed. My child usually slept with his nurse in a little room off my bedchamber, but now I called her to bring the baby to me, and I took him into bed and drew him to my bosom, finding comfort in the thought that my child would never desert me, and that no one on earth had power to take him from me. What a soothing balm that little form was pressed to my heart! I lay awake nearly all that night, not with trouble or anxiety, but with thoughts and plans for the future of my child and myself. I had made up my mind. If I should get no answer from Saviola, I would make ready and leave Switzerland for Ireland. I would go with my child to Weirdwaste, which was my own, and live there as I had lived before the fatal journey to Brighton. I would live among my warm hearted Irish tenants, who, poor as my forefathers had been for generations, had never been oppressed, but always helped to the extent of our power. They had loved my mother, had loved me for her sake, and they would now welcome and love my child, who would be the heir of Weirdwaste, if of nothing more. I would live at Weirdwaste until the return of my father, when I would confess all my faults and follies to him and appeal to his affection for forgiveness and protection. In 2 years and a few months I should be of age, and should enter into the full possession of my poor, old estate. I should live there always, and bring up my boy to be a Christian gentleman and a good and wise landlord. The excellent vicar should be his tutor, and look after his education, and the amiable doctor should be his physician, and look after his health. Francis, my dear brother, would visit me often, I felt sure. My father would come sometimes. These were all I really cared to see. We should be happy, my little son and I, in spite of all that had passed. He would never, from his father's example, grow up to become a gambler, a wine bibber, or an adventurer. He should be trained to become an honor to his name and a blessing to his tenantry. Thinking these pleasant thoughts, I fell asleep at last, and realized all my anticipations in my dreams. The next day, and every day for a week, Angus Anglesea came to see me. He no longer spoke of Saviola, but he talked to me of my dear brother, his own dearest friend, a theme of which I never tired. He told me that his ardent studies at Eton had overtasked his strength. His physicians recommended a long vacation and a total change of air and scene. Therefore he accompanied his father and stepmother to the Canaries, Dr. Alexander and the Rev. Dr. Clement, of Weirdwaste, attending the party, as traveling physician and private tutor. "So," said I, "that is the reason why none of my letters addressed to my old friends at Weirdwaste were ever answered. But since the vicar and the doctor were conscripted for foreign service, who, may I ask, was left to take charge of the souls and bodies of the poor people at Weirdwaste?" "My child, clergymen and physicians are as plenty as wild berries. A curate without a parish and a doctor without a practice were easily found to fill the places of the hard-worked and badly paid old vicar and doctor, who needed rest and change about as much as any of the traveling party." "So all my friends are in the Canaries?" "Except myself, Elfrida. I am here, and I will remain near you, to guard you as an elder brother, until your fate is decided." "A girl's fate is supposed to be decided when she is married, but that does not take into account the possibility of her desertion by her husband," I replied, but without any bitterness of feeling. "No," he admitted, very gravely. "No, because such possibilities are as exceptional as they are tragical. But take courage, Elfrida. As I was your brother's truest friend and brother, so I will be yours, to remain near you, to guard you and assist you as long as you may need me." "Thank you, Angus. Oh, thank you! I am glad that all my family and friends are in the Canaries, since it is so good for them to be there. And I am glad, oh, so glad that you are here, Angus. I do not feel quite alone and helpless now that you are here. It is very good of you to say that you will remain near me until something is settled. But will not your doing so interfere with some of your previous engagements?" "Not with any," he replied. "I am an idle man, and even if it were not so, even if I were over head and ears in business, I should let all go in order to be of service to my dear friend's sister in her need. And believe me, Elfrida, I find the greatest happiness in serving you." His generous devotion moved me to tears. I thanked him in the most earnest words at my command. The week passed, and no letter came from Saviola. I was not disappointed, for now I scarcely expected to get one. I reconciled myself to my fate as a forsaken wife all the more cheerfully for my child's sake, who would thus be saved from the baleful effects of his father's evil example. The week passed, and though no letter came from Saviola, no word on the subject was spoken between Anglesea and myself. CHAPTER XXXII. A wolf in sheep's clothing. Anglesea watched me closely, as if in anxiety to see how much the suspense and uncertainty might affect my health and spirits. And I think he was surprised and pleased to discover that I was not distressed by the situation. It was on the 8th day after my letter had been dispatched that the subject of that letter was first mentioned. It was I who first spoke of it. Anglesea came in to make his usual morning call. After our greetings were over and we had sat down, I said to him: "It is now more than a week since I wrote to Saviola. I have now no longer the faintest hope of receiving an answer to my letter. I shall not wait here longer. I shall leave Geneva to morrow." "I never supposed for a moment that you would ever hear from him again. I knew, in fact, that it was impossible for you to do so, but I wished you to prove the question to yourself," he gravely replied. "You knew it? I thought that you inferred it," I exclaimed. "My inference amounted to moral conviction to positive knowledge." I did not answer him. I scarcely understood him. "What do you propose to do, Elfrida?" he inquired, gravely and tenderly taking my hand, and then adding: "Whatever it may be, you see me here ready to stand by you, to counsel and assist you to the utmost of my ability." "Oh, I thank you, Angus! I thank you with all my heart and soul! You are indeed a friend and brother raised up to me in the time of need." I hope I see clearly, that you are wasting no vain regrets on the man who is unworthy of your thoughts," he said, with a strange look that puzzled me, coming from him. I cannot define the look. I had never seen such a one on his face before, and it troubled me. I answered him: "I am not grieving, as you see; but we will not talk of Saviola. He is my husband, after all, you know." "Ah!" he said, in a sort of equivocal tone that again disturbed me. "What shall you do now, Elfrida? After leaving Geneva, I mean?" he next inquired. "I shall go at once to England, cross over to Ireland, and take up my abode at Weirdwaste, where I lived so long before that fatal visit to Brighton." "To Weirdwaste!" he exclaimed, in some surprise. "Yes. It is a poor old manor, but it is my own property in right of my mother, and I shall come into full possession of it as soon as I am of age." "But to that wild, dreary, solitary home where you spent so many lonely, secluded, unhappy years, and of which you complained to your brother and myself so bitterly." "Yes. It seemed all that you have described it to be to my wilful and impatient childhood and youth, when I longed to see and know the world. I have seen and known enough, and more than enough, of the world, and now my thoughts turn to Weirdwaste and its quiet life as a haven of rest." "My poor Elfrida, you would wear your young heart out in such a solitude." "No, I would not. I should have my child to occupy and interest me, and I shall have the poor on the estate to look after." "These duties could not fill your heart, Elfrida. You would languish into melancholia or death. Listen, Elfrida! Dearest Elfrida! You talked of that wild seacoast manor house as a haven of rest. It would not be so. It would be to you as a desert, a prison, an exile. See, Elfrida, here is your true haven of rest," he said, bending toward me with a look that sent all the blood rushing to my head and face. "What do you mean? Where?" I cried in alarm, though I did not understand his meaning. "Here!" he exclaimed, striking his breast, and then extending both hands toward me. "Here, in my love, in my arms, in my bosom! Oh, Elfrida, accept the life's devotion of one who adores you, and who will gladly consecrate all his days to your happiness." I could no longer misunderstand him, nor could I speak for amazement and indignation. He took advantage of my silence to pour out the malabordge of his revolting passion before me. At last, with a great effort, I conquered the speechless panic into which his insults had thrown me, and my wrath and shame burst forth in strong and fiery words. I ordered him from my presence, but he did not go. I called him hard names: a snake in the grass, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a traitor, a hypocrite. He did not reply. He stood up before me and took it all, devouring me with his eyes, while his tongue was silent. At length my paroxysm of violence broke down in tears, and I wept in bitter anguish. "Although I am forsaken, yet still I am a wife," I said. "Though my husband has left me, yet still he is my husband." These words gave him the opportunity he now wanted. I had sunk down in my chair and covered my face with my hands. He came up to me, laid his hand on the back of my chair, and dropping his voice to the lowest tones of reverential sympathy, he said these terrible words: "No, Elfrida! No, my poor child! It breaks my heart to tell you the truth that I have only recently learned to my dismay; but you must hear it sooner or later. Better to hear it kindly, tenderly told by a friend's tongue than harshly and suddenly by a worldling's or an enemy's. No, Elfrida, you are no wife." "Saviola is dead, then!" I exclaimed, in an access of excitement. No, Elfrida, that is not what I mean. You are no wife, because you never have been." I lifted my head and gazed on him in dumb horror and amazement. He met my look with one of deepest sorrow and commiseration. "It is false!" I cried, as soon as I could speak. "It is foully, cruelly false!" "I would to Heaven it were!" he sighed. "I would to Heaven it were!" There was something in his look and tone that seemed to force truth and despair into my soul. Had my marriage ceremony been unlawful, notwithstanding Anglesea's pretended carefulness? Or what had happened? How had I been betrayed? I struggled not to believe him, not to question him, but I could not help doing both. "Why do you say such?" I had no words strong enough to utter my thought. He answered me as if I had done so. "Because I must, Elfrida. I came to Geneva for that purpose. I came from Saviola, charged with a message to you." He ceased. "Go on," I said. "Go on." I was at that moment almost insane. It took all my power of self control to keep still. "I met him in Paris 2 weeks ago. He told me that he was on the eve of marriage with Mademoiselle de la Villemonte, daughter of the Duc de la Villemonte; that he had not the courage to write and break his connection with you, especially as such writing would be dangerous. It might bring you on to Paris to try to prevent it, which would be awkward. So he prayed me to take his farewell message to you. I will not insult you, Elfrida, by giving his message." "Yes, give it. Do not spare me!" I cried out in my agony. "Then it was to the effect that he was obliged by circumstances to part with you, but that as soon as he could command the fortune he was to receive with Mademoiselle de la Villemonte, he would make a suitable provision for you and your child." "You heard him say that? You, my brother's friend, and you did not slay him on the spot?" I cried, with all my blood on fire. "My dear Elfrida, my scorn, contempt and indignation might have led me to knock the villain down and trample him to death. But, my child, we are all living in civilized Europe and in the 19th century, and our education teaches us to subdue the wild beast that is within us. Besides, I had you to think of. If I should slay Saviola and be cast into prison, who would take care of you? Your father and brother, even your old pastor and doctor, were away in the Canaries, and you had not a friend in the world near you." "And I have not now!" I cried, in bitter despair. "Do not say that, Elfrida. I lay my life at your feet." "No more of that! Your every word insults me. And you could come here with a false face and let me write to that man and never tell me what you have only told me now. My dear Elfrida, could I burst upon you suddenly with news that, for aught I then knew, might have killed you on the spot or maddened you for life? No, none but a brute could have done so. I had to feel my way, to lead you slowly up to the truth, to strengthen you to bear it. That is why I allowed you to write to Saviola and to wait for a letter from him. That is why I watched your every tone and look. While doing so, I perceived that your happiness did not depend on your union with Saviola. Tell me this," I burst out, almost furiously. "How was it that you, who went ostensibly to guard me against misadventure, became accessory to some deception which rendered that marriage rite performed between me and Saviola of no legal effect? Tell me this, oh traitor and hypocrite!" CHAPTER 33 and 34 of When Shadows Die by E.D.E.N. Southworth. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33 How It Happened. "My dearest Elfrida, for my beastly stupidity I deserve all the reproaches you can heap upon me, but not the utter reproach of complicity in the deception that was practiced upon you. I never suspected Saviola of a design to deceive you. But the Italian was too deep for me. I went to insure you against mistake, not deception. But, as I say, the Italian was too deep for me." "What do you mean?" I cried. "Saviola had studied the route to Scotland with the design to deceive you. There were 2 stations on that route of similar names. One was in Kelton, in Northumberland; the other was Kilton, in Scotland. Saviola took tickets for us all to Kelton when he made us believe that they were for Kilton. We went by the night train, you remember. We got out at Kelton, near the border on the English side, believing all the time that it was Kilton on the Scottish side. There, in England, you were married regularly enough; but because it was in England, and you were a minor, marrying without the consent of your parents or guardians, therefore the marriage was illegal, null and void." Did Saviola tell you this when you met in Paris?" "Yes, but I had discovered the fact, to my great dismay and distress, before that." "When, and how?" "In September I was going up to Scotland for a week's shooting. I went by the same train that had carried us, but in the daytime. When we stopped at Kelton, I recognized the station at which we had got out, the hotel where we had stopped for breakfast, and the distant church, with the manse beside it, where the marriage ceremony had been performed. And yet I knew then, as I had not known on that fatal night, that we had not crossed the border." "Then we were married in England!" I wailed. "Yes. To settle the point, I asked a fellow passenger how far we were from the Scottish border. He told me just 5 miles. Still, I did not then suspect Saviola of having wilfully betrayed us. I thought he had confused the two, Kelton and Kilton, and had made a fatal mistake. And I cursed my own stupidity in not having foreseen and prevented it. I determined to seek you both out and have the mistake rectified by another and a regular marriage ceremony as soon as possible. I did not know where to find you, nor of whom to inquire for you, since your friends were all in the Canary Islands. It was by accident only that I met him in Paris and learned the truth from his own lips, as I have already told you." He ceased to speak. Overwhelmed as I was, I tried to make some little stand for my own dignity and self respect. I said: "The marriage, in spite of quibbles, was a marriage in the sight of God, if not in the sight of man. The good old minister who pronounced the nuptial benediction over two young people who, at that time at least, loved each other, and who were free to wed, married us as lawfully, as sacredly as all the United State and Church could have married us. Repudiated and abandoned as I may be, I am still the wife of Luigi Saviola, and I will be true to myself. Though he has sacrilegiously wedded another woman, he is still my husband, and I will be faithful to him." I had by this time recovered my self possession, and felt some regret at the paroxysm of emotion into which I had been thrown. "Elfrida," he said, "this is sheer fatuity. You have no more right to call yourself the wife of Prince Saviola than you have to call yourself the consort of the Czar. You are not a wife. You are free to accept the love and devotion that I lay at your feet." I felt my heart rising again in wrath. I did not wish again to lose my self control. I commanded myself, and, with forced calmness and some sarcasm, inquired: "Do I understand you to be offering me marriage, Mr. Anglesea?" He took his hand from the back of my chair, over which he had been leaning, and walked away with a look of petulance and annoyance. Presently he returned to my side, and said: "Dearest Elfrida, men do not offer marriage under these circumstances." I turned and looked him straight in the face as I demanded: "What, then, is it that you do offer your friend's sister?" He winced slightly, but answered: "All that a man may offer, under the circumstances: love, devotion, protection, my heart and my fortune, the use of my country seat and town house until ahem! Such settlements as may secure your future from want. Elfrida, hear me!" And again he poured forth a torrent of insults, which pretended to be love, admiration, adoration, what you will, but which were gross insults. When he had talked himself out of breath, I only answered: "Mr. Anglesea, you have offended me beyond hope of pardon. Leave my presence at once, and never dare to enter it again." He did not go, but stood there and recommenced his insulting suit. I went and put my hand upon the bell. "Will you leave the room, or shall I call the people of the house to put you out?" "Neither, Elfrida. You will hear me," he said. I pulled the cord, and with such an effect that a servant quickly entered the room. "Show this gentleman out," I said. The man bowed and held the door open. "Thanks, Fritz. I can find my own way. You needn't wait," said Anglesea, with cool insolence. The man bowed and withdrew. Anglesea turned to me with a smile. Quick as lightning, I formed a resolution and acted upon it. I darted through the door leading into my bedroom, closed it behind me, and shot the bolt to secure myself. I heard him laugh as I dropped breathless into a chair. "What is it, madame?" inquired the nurse, who was seated beside my sleeping baby's crib. "Nothing," I answered, and the girl, seeing that I did not mean to be questioned, became silent. Soon I heard Anglesea leave the room and walk downstairs. A little later on I rang again, and gave orders that if the gentleman who had just gone out came again, he was not to be admitted to my apartments. Then I began my preparations for leaving Geneva. I clung with all my heart and soul and strength to the conviction that my marriage was sacred. Saviola and myself were both single when we married. The venerable minister of God who united us was most solemnly in earnest when he performed the rites and gave us his benediction. We were married, and no subsequent nuptials of Saviola could affect that undeniable fact. Yet, though I felt so sure of the reality and sanctity of our marriage, I was resolved never under any circumstances to be reunited with Saviola so long as a doubt of the fact remained on my mind. I would go, as I had planned, to Weirdwaste and live there with my child, retaining my marriage name and title for the boy's sake as well as for my own. I made such progress with my preparations that they were completed by nightfall. Anna, my Swiss nursemaid, agreed to go with me to England and remain with me until I could supply her place, when I would pay her expenses back to Geneva. After my tea was over that evening, and as Fritz went out with the service, I told him to bring my bill, and have it include the night's lodging and the next morning's breakfast. He left to do my errand. In half an hour he returned, followed by some one with a firm footstep. I thought it was Anglesea, and flushed with indignation. "A gentleman to see you, madame," said the waiter, throwing open the door. "Did I not forbid you " I began, but stopped suddenly and aghast. It was my father who stood before me. CHAPTER XXXIV FATHER AND DAUGHTER Yes, it was my father who stood before me. He was dressed in deep mourning, and he looked older by 20 years than when I had seen him last. As I gazed on his worn face, on which there was no trace of anger, but only sorrow, I was suddenly smitten with remorse for all I had done to him, wrongs of which I never realized the enormity until now. The cry of the prodigal son rose in agony to my lips: "Father, forgive me!" He opened his arms, and I threw myself within them. He folded me to his bosom in sorrow too deep for words, yet I felt that I was forgiven as I sobbed on his shoulder. After a few minutes he lifted my head, kissed me, and led me to the sofa. When I had dropped upon the cushion he sat down beside me, put his arm protectingly around me, and then he spoke for the first time. "It is I who need forgiveness. I, who left my poor, motherless little girl for long years to the care of hirelings and eye servants, who betrayed their trust and left her an easy prey to villainy. Yes, it is I who need forgiveness, Elfrida, my child. Can you forgive me?" "Oh, father, father, do not speak so to me who sinned against you so grievously, to me who ought to be on my knees at your feet," I said. And in the excess of remorse that his patient, forgiving words inspired, I would have kneeled to him, but that he stopped me and drew me again to his bosom. We spoke no more to each other for a few moments. At last he said, in a broken voice: "Did you know your poor stepmother was dead, Elfrida?" "I thought so, from your mourning dress, papa. I am very sorry for you," I replied. "She passed away in the Canaries 5 weeks since. I have the comfort of knowing that everything which human power could do was done for her. I devoted the last 12 years of my life solely to her, going with her wherever there was any hope for benefit. And for this cause I left my poor motherless child exposed to the beasts of prey that infest this world." "Father, dear father, say nothing more of that. I am alive, and since you have forgiven me, I am almost happy again. Dear father, let us live for each other now. I will be the most loving, the most faithful, devoted daughter that ever parent had. I will live for you, father. Only for you. And for my child, my boy." "Your child, Elfrida?" he said, staring at me, while a shiver passed through his frame. "Yes, the child of my wilful, unfortunate marriage, dear father. I wrote and told you all about my marriage, but I fear you never got my letter." "No," he said, with a visible effort to recover from the shock he had received. "No. I heard of your marriage from other sources, and not until I returned to England, 3 weeks ago, with the remains of my wife, for interment in the vault at Enderby Castle. The news met me there. Terrible news to meet a father coming home to bury his wife. Oh, my father! Oh, my father! Can you forgive me?" I cried out at this. "I could not forgive myself, child. I never dreamed of blaming you. Does anyone blame the bird that is snared?" he tenderly inquired. "You are too merciful to me, too merciful. I do not deserve it," I said, covering my face with my hands, for my father's kind words pierced my heart like poniards. "Hush, child, hush! Do not reproach yourself so bitterly. Let me tell you how it was that I did not receive any tidings of your marriage until my return to England." "I know, dear father. It was because you were far away in the Canaries." "That was not all, my child. Listen. while I was still in the archipelago, late in October, I received a batch of letters from England, all bringing me good news of my son and daughter. There was one from you, telling me of your fully restored health and good spirits, and your desire to spend the winter at Brighton. Another, from Miss Murray, giving a very flattering account of your progress in education. A third was from Madame de la Champe, much to the same effect. Those letters were written only 3 days before my hasty marriage. And oh, believe me, papa, before I even dreamed of taking such a hasty step," I earnestly declared. "I do believe you, my child. You shall explain later. The same mail brought me a long letter from your brother who had gone to Eton. He told me of his long summer vacation spent with you at Brighton, and he corroborated the intelligence given by yourself and your governess as to your health, good spirits, and rapid progress. He also asked leave to spend the Christmas holidays with you at Brighton." Here I sighed so heavily that my father stopped and laid his hand on mine in sympathy, while he resumed: "All these letters gave me great satisfaction on account of my dear children. They were especially comforting to me at that time, as I was about to leave the archipelago for the Canaries. I did not notice then that Glennon had omitted to say one word about his own health, which was always delicate, he having inherited the constitution of his mother." "He looked well when he left Brighton," I ventured to say. "Yes, but he did not continue well after resuming his studies. The same mail that brought me his letter brought one from one of the physicians at Eton. I had overlooked all my other correspondence in dwelling upon the letters from my children, but at length I took up one in a strange handwriting, which, on opening, proved to be from the physician who had been attending my son for some seemingly slight disorder in his health. This Dr. Fletcher wrote to me to say that the state of my son's health was such that Glennon should leave Eton and have a thorough change of air, scene and diet. He suggested that he should have a traveling tutor and go to a warmer and drier climate." "I had heard that he went with you to the Canaries," I said. "Yes," continued my father. "I quickly made up my mind in regard to Glennon. I wrote to my two old friends, Dr. Alexander and the Rev. Mr. Clement, asking them if they could procure substitutes to fill their places at Weirdwaste, and accompany us to the Canaries for the winter, the one to take charge of the young viscount's health, and the other to direct his studies in a very moderate manner." "I heard, too, that the doctor and the vicar joined your party," I said. "Yes, though I scarcely ventured to hope that they would. And really I was as much surprised as pleased when I received letters from them accepting my offer and promising, according to my request, in case of their acceptance, to go to Eton, join my son, and accompany him to Gibraltar, and there await the arrival of our steamer." My father paused for a few moments, looked at me remorsefully, and said: "I little knew how I was about to leave my dear, only daughter, my poor motherless girl. We sailed early in November, but before sailing I answered your letter and those of your teachers, expressing the great satisfaction I felt in your improved health and good progress, thanking your teachers for all their supposed zeal and care, and telling you that you should winter at Brighton while we were at the Canaries." "Oh, I never saw that letter, father. I had gone on my mad journey before that letter came," I said. "I know it now, my dear. I did not know it then, when I said in cheerful confidence that I had left you so safe and happy. At Gibraltar your brother, with the vicar and the doctor, joined us, and in a few days we sailed for Santa Cruz de Teneriffe. Where were you then, my dear?" "I was in Paris, anxiously waiting for an answer to the letter I had written you, announcing my marriage, and asking your forgiveness." "A letter which I missed by leaving the Grecian archipelago before it arrived. And oh, how long, in my ignorance, how long I waited and hoped to hear from you! As I waited and hoped to hear from you, not understanding your silence, after we had been some weeks settled at Santa Cruz, I began to be seriously uneasy at not hearing from you, as I had especially requested you, in my last letter, to direct your answer to Santa Cruz de Teneriffe. But the countess urged that you would probably wait to hear of our arrival before writing. Then I wrote to you and waited for an answer. None came. Then I wrote to the postmaster at Brighton for information, and in due time received an answer that your whole party had left the town, without leaving any directions at the post office where letters should be forwarded. This I attributed to carelessness on your teacher's part and inexperience on yours. I left too suddenly and too madly to have thought of such a provision, and I know not how my governesses left after they discovered my flight. I know how they left, but I did not learn until later. From the postmaster's imperfect information I judged that you had returned to Weirdwaste. There I addressed my next letters, with no more success than had attended all the others. I received no answer. I was uneasy, but not anxious. I thought that you were living under the care of your teachers at Weirdwaste, and I hoped from week to week to hear from you, and ascribed my disappointment to any other cause than the real one — to negligence, to irregular mails, and so forth. And all that time I was going from city to city with my husband, leaving always directions where my letters should be forwarded, and hoping always to hear from you. Ah, well, my dear, we were at cross purposes without knowing it. The summer came, but brought no increase of health to my poor wife. She grew worse, and my great anxiety on her account began to absorb all my thoughts. I ceased even to look for a letter from England. I understand, dear father. The present and real calamity dulled your sensibilities to imaginary troubles." "In a measure, and for a time. But at length I wrote to the steward at Weirdwaste to ask why I did not hear from you or your teachers. But ah! before there was time for an answer to return, my poor wife died, and I got ready to bring her remains to England." "My dear father!" "I took the casket first to Enderby, where, having been previously embalmed, it lay in state in the drawing room. The funeral was advertised for the 8th day after the arrival of the body, and I used the interval in going quietly down to Liverpool and taking steamer to Ireland en route for Weirdwaste, to fetch my daughter on to Enderby for the funeral. It was at Weirdwaste that the news of your marriage first met me." "Oh, father! But you have pardoned me! And so they knew nothing of it at Enderby?" "No, my dear. Consider the remoteness of each of these seats from the busy world, and their distance from each other. Enderby on the northwest coast of Northumberland, Weirdwaste on the west coast of Ireland. No, my dear, no hint of your marriage had reached Enderby, nor would it ever have reached Weirdwaste but for one circumstance." "And that, my father?" "Was the fact of your old governess, Miss Murray, having left a portion of her effects at Weirdwaste. The old lady wrote to the steward, telling him of your sudden marriage and of the consequent cessation of her services, and requesting him to forward her effects, of which she enclosed a list, to a certain address in London. Though the steward and the housekeeper both wrote to the governess when they sent her boxes, imploring her to give them more particulars of their beloved young lady, she gave them none, merely saying in the letter in which she acknowledged the receipt of her property that you had married and had gone away, more than that she said she knew nothing." I bowed my head in sorrow. I realized what my dear, stricken father must have felt to hear such news at such a time. But I know he never, even in thought, reproached me. I made every inquiry, but could learn no more at Weirdwaste. I went back to Northumberland, to Enderby, and remained until after the funeral of my dear wife. Then I went down to Brighton to make inquiries there. I found the house where you had lodged, to which all my letters had been directed, but the landlady could tell me nothing more than that the young lady had been missed one day, and that at the end of the same week the two old ladies had given up their apartments and had gone to London, and that subsequently she had heard a report that the young lady had gone off to Scotland, with the Italian, to be married, but she did not know the truth of the matter." "I do not know how the report could have got out, except through my teachers." "Of course it was through them. When I could hear no more I went up to London to transact some business with my banker. I did not like to ask any direct questions of him concerning you, nor did I have any strong hope of hearing news of you in that quarter. Nevertheless, when our accounts had been overhauled, I did venture to remark: 'My daughter has not drawn on you of late, I perceive.' 'Not for a year,' he said. 'And that reminds me,' he continued, 'that I had a letter from her highness last summer, inquiring your lordship's address. I believe it was from Geneva. I cannot lay my hands on it at this time. But — yes, I am sure it was from Geneva.' How glad I am that I wrote that letter! The banker's prompt reply was the first clue I got to your whereabouts, as the banker's news was the first clue you got to mine." "Yes, my dear. I did not ask a question, burning as I was to hear more of you. How could I ask that comparative stranger for information respecting my daughter, with whose movements I should have been perfectly familiar? I did not even know why he called you her highness. I left England that same afternoon, and came as fast as steam could bring me to Geneva. Here I am. But I do not even know the name of your husband." Again I dropped my head upon his breast. I had so much to tell him, besides the name of my husband. But he was waiting patiently for my reply. I gave it. CHAPTER 35. Chapters 35 and 36 of When Shadows Die by E.D.E.N. Southworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Chapter 35. A Shock. Prince Luigi Saviola. He stared at me in surprise, in distress. "Prince Luigi Saviola!" he echoed, without withdrawing his fixed gaze from my face. "Yes, dear father," I answered, wondering at the emotion, or rather at the panic, into which my words had thrown him. "Oh, my poor child! Oh, my dear child! And here you have been controlling and concealing your own great sorrow to listen to me and to sympathize with my lighter ones! Oh, my poor Elfrida! My poor, poor girl!" he breathed at last, with a voice full of distress and compassion that I felt sure he must have heard of Saviola's Parisian marriage, and was grieving over it more than I was for myself. I felt that I must try to comfort him. "Do not take it to heart, dear father," I said. "Look at me. I do not appear to be dying of despair, do I? Do not grieve for me, since I do not grieve for myself. Let us, from time to time, live for each other. You, dear, dear father, have had a great sorrow, which you bear like a Christian. I have had a humiliating disappointment and a wholesome lesson, though, like much of the teachings of experience, the lesson comes too late to do the pupil any good. But from this time I will forget my trouble and live for you." He was still staring at me with more wonder and amazement than before. "I had not the remotest suspicion that it was Luigi Saviola whom you had married," he murmured, as if speaking to himself. Then, after another long, speculating look at me, he inquired: "Elfrida, my darling, how came you to marry this young man? Was your act a mere whim, a childish freak, or could you have really loved him?" I saw by his whole manner that there was some afterthought in my father's mind that I did not comprehend, but I answered him: "I thought I loved him, but in my ignorance and inexperience I must have been misled by fancy and imagination to mistake admiration and enthusiasm for love. But the hallucination was strong enough to make me forget every duty I should have remembered and held sacred. "'Tell me all about your courtship and marriage, Elfrida,' he said. And then I told him, as faithfully as I have set it down here for you, Abel, every particular: of Saviola's introduction to me; of the growth of our acquaintance and its development into that false hero worship which I mistook for love; of our runaway marriage, in which Angus Anglesea aided as my guardian, saying that since he had no power to prevent the marriage, he would see that it was solemnized legally and properly." "God bless the boy!" broke in my father, with so much fervor that I had not heart to tell him afterward what a villain Anglesea had proved himself, in the sequel, to be. Then I told him of our travels, of my letters of contrition to him, of my disappointments in not hearing from him, of the gradual opening of my eyes to the true character of my husband, of my grief, wonder and humiliation at discovering that my imaginary hero, martyr, patriot, humanitarian, was no better than a professional gambler and adventurer. Still, though his life degraded himself and me, though I could no longer adore and worship him as I had done when I believed in him, still I bore with him because I really thought that he loved me, that with all his faults he was faithful to me. In this belief I lived and hoped until the end came. Then, indeed, the last scales fell from my eyes. I know that if he had ever loved me he had ceased to do so now." "Poor fellow!" murmured my father, as if he judged Saviola much more leniently than I could do. And again the impression came to me that there was an afterthought lurking in his mind, incomprehensible to mine. "Why do you pity him, father dear? I should think you would feel nothing but resentment and animosity to him." "My dear, when one has seen so much suffering as I have, one must learn mercy. He ran away with my daughter and married her, to be sure; but he was young and in love, and you were living only with careless governesses. I could have forgiven him. He took to the gaming table until hazard became the passion of his life. He was lucky in cards, but I never heard that he was dishonest. And without knowing his near relations to you and myself, I have heard a good deal of him lately." "Father, you seem to be really defending him." "Am I, my dear? Then it is because he can no longer defend himself." "No, for his conduct is utterly indefensible." "What conduct, my child?" My dear father, with all that you have heard of him lately, you cannot have heard of the shocking event at Paris." "Yes, my dear, I have heard it all, though I did not know at the time that he was your husband." "And now that you do know it, what do you think of all this, sir?" "I think, my dear, that it is strange in you, and incomprehensible to me, that you should feel no regret for the young man's tragic fate, nor wear one sign of mourning for him who was your husband. I think, my dear, that in this you should pay some respect to death, if not to the dead," he gravely replied. It was now my turn to stare at him. "Father!" I exclaimed, "I do not comprehend. What tragic fate? Who is dead? Not Luigi? I heard of him only yesterday." "Heard of him? Heard of whom? Not Saviola? Is it possible that you do not know?" "Know what, sir? I know nothing, it seems. What do you mean, dear father?" "Is it possible that you do not know Prince Luigi Saviola fell in a duel with the Duke de Montmeri nearly 2 months ago?" "Great Heaven! No, I knew nothing of all that. Oh, poor Luigi! Poor Luigi!" I covered my face with my hands, and fell back in my chair. "And you knew nothing of all this?" "Nothing! Nothing!" I moaned. "And yet the papers were full of the subject." "I never saw any papers after Luigi left me. I was expecting my child every day, and I lived very secluded, so that I heard no rumors, until very lately a report met me that he was on the eve of a marriage with a French heiress," I said, remembering the tale told me by Anglesea. "Strange that such a report as that should get afloat about a young man whose fate was well known all over Europe, and filled all hearers with compassion and sympathy." "Tell me of the duel, father. Tell me all you know," I said. "It arose at a gentlemen's dinner, given by one of the Bonapartes. The talk turned on woman, and drifted into the comparative merits of women of different European nationalities. The Duke de Montmeri, who had taken too much wine, made some injurious and sneering remarks on Italian women. The prince warmly took up the defense of his fair compatriots. High words ensued. The quarrel ended in the challenge of Saviola by Montmeri. They met the next morning in a secluded spot in the Rouveret. Montmeri was a professional duelist and a dead shot. Saviola fell at the first fire. It was a murder, no less. When his second went to raise his head, the dying man only breathed forth 3 words: 'My poor wife,' and died. Little did I think, when I read these words, that the poor wife in question was my own daughter." "Oh, Luigi! Poor Luigi! And to think that I should have listened to such cruel slanders of you, and cherished such bitter thoughts of you!" I exclaimed, in sudden remorse at the remembrance of the ready credence I had given to the story of his second marriage told me by Anglesea. "And you really knew nothing of this fatal duel until I told you about it?" again demanded my father. "Nothing, I assure you. But remember how secluded I have lived here, seeing no one but my infant boy, my nurse and my maid, except, indeed, my physician, who came daily for weeks, but who would not have been likely to speak to me of the duel, even if he had read of it, which he might not have done, you know." "Well, my love, you should now put on widow's mourning for your deceased husband," said my father, looking gravely into my face. CHAPTER XXXVI "TELL ME ALL" "I am not sure that I have the right to do so," I answered, dropping my head on my bosom. "You do not know whether you have any right to do so? What do you mean, Elfrida? Are we still at cross purposes, my dear? Or what new enigma is this?" he demanded, uneasily. "Father, I fear that a fatal mistake was made in the manner of our marriage. I fear that mistake may render it illegal. I will have no concealments from you. Therefore I must tell you even this. Once I was led to believe that Saviola made no mistake, but purposely left the train with me on the English side of the border, where our marriage without your consent would have been unlawful; but now, since I have learned that the report of this French marriage was false, I now believe that the report of his wilful deception of me in regard to the place of our marriage was also false, and that he ignorantly made the fatal mistake." "My dear girl, my dear Elfrida, what do you mean? What fatal mistake do you mean?" "I have already indicated it, my dear father, but I will tell you more distinctly," I said. And then I told him of the 2 stations on the road with similarly sounding names: Kelton, on the English side, within 5 miles of the border, and Kilton, on the Scottish side, just across the border. Intending to be married at the last mentioned place, we got out of the train by misadventure at the first, and we were married in England." "What disastrous carelessness!" he groaned. "But, father, we both acted in good faith, and were married by an ordained clergyman, and had our marriage duly recorded and witnessed. I do, for myself, feel that our marriage was lawful and sacred, as if we had been united in the presence of all our relations, by the combined powers of church and state. Still, it is for you to decide. I have concealed nothing from you, my dear father. I have now told you all. I leave my fate and my conduct in your hands. Shall I live on as the widowed Princess Saviola, or what shall I do?" "My dear Elfrida, I must think of it. I must have time to decide. This is a complication, an embarrassment for which, dear child, I was not at all prepared. No, do not look distressed, child. I do not blame you. Before you came I had made up my mind to leave Geneva and return to Ireland and take up my abode at Weirdwaste, where you yourself had fixed my home. Although I believed then that my husband had repudiated the ceremony performed at Kelton, deserted me, and married a French heiress, still I had determined to stand by my marriage, to call myself by my husband's name, and to live in seclusion at Weirdwaste, and devote myself to the education of my son and to the care of the poor. Such was the plan of life I had laid out for myself before your arrival, my dear father. Indeed, my trunks are already packed, and my hotel bill paid up to noon to morrow. But now I place myself in your hands most gladly, and I will abide by your judgment." "You could not do better, my dear. One part of your plan may be carried out at once. We will leave this place to morrow morning for England, but not for Ireland. Not for Weirdwaste. Rather for a little place of mine to which you have never been, because, in fact, it was leased for 21 years, and the lease will only expire on the last day of December." "You mean Myrtle Grove, on the south coast?" "Yes, dear. I have given orders that as soon as it is vacated it is to be put in complete order. I intended to live there in strict seclusion. I did not know that I should have the comfort of my dear daughter's society. For the present, that will be better than Weirdwaste for you, my child." I could not but agree with my father in this view of the case. Then, as it was growing late, I rang for supper, which was promptly served in my sitting room. I asked my father if he had engaged apartments for the night. He told me that he had not; that he had set out from the railway station to find me first, having left all his luggage in charge of his valet at the station. But he said that he would attend to the matter immediately after supper, which he did. He succeeded in procuring rooms in the same house and in the same corridor with me. Then he sent a messenger from the hotel to the station to fetch his valet with the luggage. When these arrived he bade me good night and retired to his apartment. He had not seen my beautiful boy, nor had he asked to see him, nor had I the courage to propose to show him. Now I felt a little grieved at this neglect of my innocent child. Early the next morning we left Geneva, and, traveling as fast as steam could carry us by land and sea, in due time we reached London. We put up at one of the quietest hotels at the West End. Here my father insisted that I should pay off my French maid and my Swiss nurse, and send each back to her own country. When they were gone, he said: "And now we take leave of the Princess Saviola forever, and we know only Lady Elfrida Glennon." "But my boy, dear father! My boy!" I pleaded. "A proper nurse must be procured for the child without delay. Some healthy young married woman living in the country, who will take the whole charge of the boy before we leave London. He is the child of a deceased son of mine, and so delicate that he must be reared in the country, and fed on fresh milk and fresh air." "And must I part with my child, oh, father?" I pleaded. "For a time you must, for his sake as well as for your own. What should Lady Elfrida Glennon do with the young child at Myrtle Grove?" I would have pleaded with him, but I saw at a glance that it was useless to do so. Kind, tender, gentle, yielding as my father was in most cases, yet when he once made up his mind to any course his will was as strong as fate. Besides, I and my child were both in his power. I had no other alternative than to obey him. And finally, notwithstanding the pain I felt in parting from my boy, I could not fail to see that, under the circumstances, it was best for the child, and best for us all, that he should be put out to be nursed. I took the sole charge of the child while we were seeking for a nurse. We had many applications, but I was hard to please. At length the right woman came, A fine, fresh, young creature, with a plump form, bright eyes, rosy cheeks, a pleasant smile and a sweet voice. She attracted me at sight. She was the wife of a young dairyman. She had one child, a week older than my boy, and she was well able to nurse twins, if Heaven had sent twins to her. She was willing and anxious to take our little orphan. She invited us to go down into Kent and see for ourselves the comfort and cleanliness of the dairy farm, and the health and liveliness of her own child. We took her at her word, and went home with her, only a few miles from London, and we were so well satisfied with all we found there that we concluded it would be difficult to do as well, and impossible to do better, anywhere else, and we left the baby with her, with a check for £25 that was to be renewed quarterly. I may here say that this young woman, Mary Chester, did her full duty by her nursling, as I found in my periodical visits to the dairy. As soon as Myrtle Grove was ready for occupation, my father took me down there. It was a comparatively small place, but a lovely, secluded home, in a deep, green, wooded glen, about 3 miles inland from the sea. Here we lived a very quiet life, seeing no one but the vicar, the Rev. Mr. Ashe, of St. Agnes Church, the country practitioner, Dr. Ray, and the country lawyer, Mr. Flood, who was my father's local man of business. We were both in deep mourning for my stepmother, and that fact justified our seclusion from the world. Once my brother came down from Eton to spend the Easter holidays. He had never heard of my runaway match, and my father decided that he never should hear of it. Once a month my father took me to the dairy farm in Kent to see his grandchild, the child of his deceased son, as he called my boy, and as the people at the dairy cottage believed him to be. And it is no falsehood, Elfrida, my dear. The lad is my grandchild, and is the child of my deceased son in law," he said. Our deep mourning was supposed by the dairy people to be worn for this same deceased son and brother. Looking back, I think I had never before spent so calm, peaceful and contented a time as at Myrtle Grove. CHAPTER 37